Let me just say you have to be nearly a senior citizen to be assigned the title My Life. And I am. But also, I also want to start by thanking Synergy for asking me to be here in this great lineup. They do great work, and I'm just very honored to be here with all, and thank all of you for being here too. I don't have that Steve Jobs thing down yet, you know, where you walk and talk, so I actually did old school. I wrote my notes, so thus the podium, and here we go. I've reinvented myself at least a dozen times in a life that spans 6 decades. The only thing that hasn't changed is trying to remain true to myself. I say this at the threshold of a new phase of my life, which always is the best time to reflect. When I look back, reinvention for me has been the result of 3 defining components of my personality: ambition, fear, and survival. Let me take you back to the 1960s. I'm a suburban teenager, feeling trapped, wanting the world, and fascinated by bylines. The transformative event happened at the Shoreham Hotel, waiting for the Beatles to arrive for their first US concert. I broke through the police line to chase George, John, Paul, and Ringo down the driveway as they arrived in their limos. As they stepped out of the cars, I ran up to each, touched them, and then I followed them to the elevator, which closed in front of me, Ringo giving me a little wave, goodbye. I wasn't done. I climbed the fire stairs of the hotel, thinking I could get to their rooms that way, and as I crawled along the hallway, literally on my hands and knees, I was stopped by a man in gray trousers, a navy blue blazer, white shirt and ascot. He was Brian Epstein. He said the boys were napping and couldn't be disturbed. Dejected, I returned to the lobby and waited for my father to come pick me up. The elevator doors opened and 2 young women came out, bouncing and happy, carrying notepads. Curious, I asked, why so happy? They said they were reporters and they'd just spent an hour with the Beatles. So much for napping. Literally like a light bulb going off, I announced to my family, I'm going to be a reporter. I graduated from high school in 1968, the year of the TED Offensive in Woodstock, and moved into the city, this city, into my very own one-room apartment. Was I scared to move from my parents' home? Yes. It was the great unknown, and I would be on my own, but I had a dream to pursue. I landed an entry-level job at United Press International, pre-Mooney United Press International, but soon was getting reporting assignments. Inevitably, I put myself in situations that scared me. I was assigned to cover the anti-war movement, the then anti-war movement, and was regularly in the middle of demonstrations. Big marches on the city, hundreds of thousands of people, riot police at the ready, me with my notepad in hand. I went where the protesters went, even if that meant into melees, as they lobbed rocks through bank windows, stormed police barricades, upended cars, set them on fire. I actually kept a crash helmet, as did other reporters, just for these occasions. I was expert at getting tear gas out of my eyes so I could read my notes and dictate my story over the payphone, and then get back to the clash between the police and the protesters. It sounds so much like right now, doesn't it? My byline was on the front page of papers all over the world. Because I was 18, the police assumed I was a protester and often tried to arrest me until I showed them my police press pass and they had to let me go. It's 1970, the trial of H. Rap Brown. It was scheduled to begin in Bel Air, Maryland. He'd been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for riot and gun charges related to the civil rights movement. I ingratiated myself with defense lawyer William Kunstler, who I'd met during the Chicago 7 trial. He said if I covered the Rap Brown trial, I would be welcomed at the defense team's house in Havre de Grace. I was warned by police friends to keep my distance, but of course I ignored them. At the house, it is Kunstler and several Black Panthers. They're suspicious of me, but I tried to appear cool. I'm scared, but I wanted the story. I was more scared of not getting the story. Late that night in Bel Air, a car exploded. The 2 passengers were killed. Police said the men were carrying a bomb they planned to detonate at the Bel Air courthouse. The explosion made a good story into a huge story, and I was there. I have access to Kunstler. My byline, again, is on the front page of papers everywhere. Time magazine hired me to come work in their New York headquarters. New York, the Big Apple. I was 21. My father put me on the train with my odd assortment of suitcases. I was alone, scared, but excited. That first night in Manhattan, I walked through Times Square, overwhelmed, stunned, but delighted with my new home. Time assigned me to a range of stories. After Washington, I loved the diversity. The premiere of The Godfather, the presidential conventions, trafficking and teenage prostitution, the final Apollo launch. I was on the McGovern campaign bus. I took a memorable road trip with Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden as they toured campuses to protest the war. I spent the night in the back of a New York police squad car as they chased bad guys till dawn. I had interview encounters with Cab Calloway, Mick Jagger, Cary Grant, Jane Russell, Lana Turner, and Lena Horne. I spent an afternoon with Warren Beatty in his hotel room talking politics. A chaste afternoon, alas. I went to an Elvis Presley news conference and asked the king, "Elvis, what are you doing after the show tonight?" He looked right at me. "Depends on what you're doing, baby." In 1972, Walter Cronkite offered me a job as a writer on the CBS Evening News. Watergate and the Vietnam War were the stories that gripped the nation. Both made Walter and CBS the source of where most Americans got their news. It's hard to explain today what a network news broadcast meant in 1972, but they were profoundly more significant than today's network broadcasts. We didn't have the internet or cable TV. We had dying newspapers, and then ABC, CBS, and NBC, and of the three, CBS was far out in front. Of course I said yes. I was 22 years old. My age didn't seem a factor to me. I felt completely ready for the job, but I saw the looks on the faces of some of my new colleagues. They saw a child. I had to overcome the doubts of many, and did. My first week on the job, the outgoing writer was supposed to be there to show me the ropes, but he had a death in the family. I was on my own with the help of a great editor. It's live television. You can't fail. I sat at Walter's side, swallowed my fear, and did what I had to do. Read the wires, screened pieces, conferred with correspondents, wrote lead-ins and other copy, all as the clock ticked towards 6:30. When the show was over, I met a friend for dinner. While I'd appeared calm all day long, it now took a half hour for me to stop shaking. For a week it was like that. I wonder how I even slept. But gradually, by week 2, I began to settle into my new life as a television writer. Over the years, we won every major journalism award, and I won 3 Writers Guild's Award for Best News Script. A few years later, Watergate was done, the Vietnam War was done, and I, at almost 25, was feeling burned out. I don't know what I wanted, but I wanted something different. I quit CBS News on good terms, packed up New York, and cast my fate to the winds, almost literally. Through a few turns of events, I ended up in the West Indies as one of the crew on a 73-foot yawl that was built in 1913 by Nathaniel Hershoff for J.P. Morgan. The owners liked to race her and charter her out. I'd never sailed before, but I learned on the job. To say it was intimidating puts it mildly, but I caught on. The boat shot through waves like a torpedo, and sometimes when we heeled over, I was sure of certain death. But it was also glorious to slice through the aquamarine Caribbean Sea in such an elegant vessel, and to swim on reefs, dance till dawn, and drink a lot of rum. I was Carol the sailor. When the cook went AWOL, I was pressed into service in the galley. I knew nothing about cooking. I don't think I'd ever cooked. I grabbed a copy of The Joy of Cooking and punted. I don't know if I was scared exactly, but I definitely had doubts. But I became Carol the boat cook. A year after arriving in Antigua, and with a 3-month pit stop in Antibes, France, I was back at CBS News as a writer, this time at the GOP presidential convention in Kansas City. From there, I stopped in Washington to see what was going on. I didn't plan to stay for long. WRC tried me out as an on-air reporter, but I found I was much happier and a whole lot less awkward off camera. NBC News offered me a gig as their night assignment editor, which was something new for me, and it felt right. It's running the control tower, really, tracking stories, making sure they get covered, the principal liaison with the correspondents in the field, and the executive producers of Nightly News and Today. Plus, I got to produce an 11 p.m. network feed to local stations. I loved the job. Still, I didn't plan to stay in Washington. Still, I wanted the world. 2 weeks shy of leaving NBC for a potential sailboat trip to Cuba, I met a dashing man named Howard Joynt. He owned a saloon in Georgetown, Nathan's. He was sophisticated, a grown-up, a dozen years my senior, and felt dangerous in a way that intrigued me. His was a world apart from mine, and I liked that too. We fell madly in love. 2 weeks later, we were living together. The Cuba trip indefinitely postponed. I was ready to become Sadie, married lady. My life took some dark turns here, largely because I made a stupid decision. I quit my job to move with Howard to a sprawling farmhouse in Upperville, Virginia, to sort of run away from the madding crowd. Giving up my work was a mistake. I wasn't suited to the idle life. I missed the energy of an office, the dynamic of colleagues, the thrill of engaging with the world out there. It was no fault of Howard's, but I began to disappear. Without work, my self-esteem got smaller and smaller until it went poof and was gone. A few years into living in Upperville, I was a 30-year-old emotional wreck. I shut myself in a closet, literally, and it wasn't a walk-in. If I left the house, I had a panic attack. I was scared of everything. I was Carol the basket case. As I would recommend to anybody in that situation, I got psychiatric help. And with that help, I put myself solidly back together. I returned to work at CBS News as one of the producers of Night Watch, hosted by Charlie Rose. And then 3 years after coming out of that closet, Charlie and I were on stage at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, winning the Emmy for Best Network Interview, a 1-hour prison interview with Charles Manson at San Quentin Prison. Was I scared to go into a no-hostage policy, maximum security prison? Totally. But I was not scared to accept the Emmy for my efforts. Over the next 10 years, my career and personal life grew beautifully. There was a wonderful spell at ABC News as a producer for This Week and then Nightline. I spent a few years directing documentary films for the National Gallery of Art and became Carol the documentary filmmaker. I also had my son Spencer and became Carol the mother, which is the best role of all. I returned to network news as a producer for Larry King. This was a marvelous time because Larry King Live in the 90s was a completely happening show, holding up CNN almost entirely on its own. Great guests, great shows. I had a blast. Happy at home with my husband and son, happy at work with a great team of colleagues. In 1997, Howard died suddenly from pneumonia. Overnight, I acquired monikers no one ever wants: widow, solo parent, and entirely to my surprise, federal tax fraud defendant. I learned about the last part 2 weeks after Howard died, when his lawyers called me in for a visit. As his heir, I not only inherited the bankrupt saloon, but also the $3 million fraud case. The crime was a blunder of my husband's, a blunder not uncommon in the saloon business, but still monumental in how it would shake and shape our lives. Nothing would ever be the same now, and I had to be stronger than ever before. What mattered more than anything was taking care of our 5-year-old son. But if I didn't take on the IRS, we would have nothing. And that's where Innocent Spouse comes in. It begins with Howard's death and ends 12 years later when I finally got off the Titanic, which is how I thought of Nathan's. I got free of the IRS and I got free of Nathan's. It cost me a lot of money, career, security, peace of mind. I got through it thanks to friends and lawyers, lots and lots of lawyers. Owning a small business was the last thing I was ever prepared for, especially one that was on the ropes. But as with sailing, which I'd not done before I became a deckhand, I did what I had to do. I was scared, of course, petrified, more with this role than any of the others, but I had to do it for us to survive. I had good lawyers. I had a very able staff at Nathan's, but it was up to me to stay steady and focused. Publicly, that's what I did. Privately, with Nathan's draining us of every last dime, I lived in nearly constant worry and despair. Winning the IRS case, winning Innocent Spouse, helped my self-confidence. Surviving Nathan's did too. I became a free woman in 2009 when I was at long last able to close Nathan's. People still ask if I miss it. Yes, but only as a customer, not as the owner. I spent the next 2 years writing my book. I was very fortunate to get a book contract from Crown, and I was very happy to become Carol the author. In February of this year, 3 months before my book was supposed to come out, in a routine mammogram, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I became Carol the cancer patient, but here's the good news. It was a routine annual mammogram. It was found so early, it was microscopic. In fact, a doctor wouldn't have even been able to feel it. It was still in the cell stage, not even yet a tumor. And they diagnosed it as a stage 0 breast cancer. I had a lumpectomy. I did radiation. I went on tamoxifen. And when my book came out on May 10th, I was able to be on the Today Show with Matt Lauer. So I say to everybody, get your routine mammograms, because it's amazing what they can find now early. And then in August, with the book duties done and my son gone off to college, I began job hunting. I was petrified. Would there be any jobs? Would anybody hire me? I made a pact with myself to apply to 2 jobs a day, and I did. I was actually surprised by the response. The fact that there were jobs and that employers considered maturity and experience as assets, who knew? It came down to 3 possibles. 2 were corporate, but in the end, I chose to return to media, doing something I've not done before, working for a monthly magazine. In exactly 1 week, I start as the editor-at-large at Washingtonian, so I'm rejoining the ranks of the employed. I'm scared, of course, but so what's new? Again, for me, that's at the root of reinvention. I hope you'll go to Amazon, somewhere you see my book. I hope you'll go to Amazon and perhaps order my book, Innocent Spouse. And I hope you'll visit my website, caroljoynt.com, where, regardless of what happens, I will continue to write the blog, Swimming in Quicksand. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.